Welcome to What School Should Have Taught You, a podcast where I share with you all the lessons about wealth creation and answer your questions along the way too. Click the link below to send in your questions and we could be chatting on the show. I'm Jeremy Iannuzzelli, and today we're going to talk about gross yields versus net yields.
Everything school should have taught you in one place. With a property portfolio of over 17 million and an accountancy firm of over 16,000 clients, as well as being an accountant to some of the wealthiest people in Australia, Jeremy Iannuzzelli will be sharing his lessons on everything school should have taught you so you can build the life you want.
Gross yields versus net yields. Now, it's always a very common theme, and it's always a very common misconception that gross yields means that that's the money that we're getting in our pocket, and net yields often gets missed. And it's a great topic, and it's a great sales pitch by any investment advisor or property analyst or property buyer, but we're really going to break it down today, what gross and what net yields mean. Now, I come across many different clients that quote great gross yields, and then we really have to break it down in the end, what comes into their back pocket. So I'm going to have some illustrations today to really show you how to understand and determine what a gross yield is and what a net yield is. And for this particular purpose, we're going to talk about the raw cost of the property, or we're going to talk about the raw cost of, say, the investment or share, and disregard some of the buying costs around it. While sometimes they can be material in the calculation, meaning they can adjust or change the calculation a little bit, we're just going to really show you the metrics and how to break it down so you can make your own decisions when you're investing in either a property or shares or any other investment to determine what is my real income that I'm going to be achieving from this particular investment when it's unencumbered, free of any debt. So I'm going to just show you guys, just on a very small illustration, this $100,000 investment and what it may look like. And we're going to talk about a $100,000 property, and we're going to talk about $100,000 worth of shares. And I'm going to share with you some horror stories that I've seen in the past. So what we have here is our $100,000 investment. 100K. This is the money that we've put into our particular investment. As it stands, I like to work out, well, what's the yield? Now, often we'll hear about, okay, we're after a 5% gross yield. GY, gross yield. So what we can reliably estimate is that on that $100,000 in a year, we will achieve $5,000 in return. Just as a note, guys, if you're listening on iTunes or Spotify, go over to our YouTube channel and you'll be able to see all these illustrations. But we're coming back to what we've said. So $100,000 invested and a 5% gross return. That means we have now $5,000 in that financial year or in that calendar year, depending on the way that you want to calculate your level of return. But let's say 365 days. This is the amount of money that you'll be achieving. Now, for this particular purchase, we're going to say that there is no costs attached to the return. So in this particular case, we have now a $5,000 net return. This is a fantastic achievement, and not often is it always going to be exactly the same. In very many circumstances, you will see that net returns are often lower than gross returns. But for this particular purpose, what we do have is a $5,000 gross return with no costs attached to that level of investment, obtaining us a $5,000 net return. Now, in an ideal world, I would call this a fantastic investment. Why? Because there's no costs attached to earning that level of return. There's no advisor fees, there's no management fees, or there's no occupancy costs attached to it. So this is a very raw calculation of achieving a 5% gross, which translates to a 5% net. This is a perfect world, and unfortunately the world that we live in from an investment perspective doesn't always end up like this. So I'm going to share with you now a typical scenario of where our net return often is significantly or partially lower than our gross return. The old age debate, shares versus property, which one's better? Which provides a better cash flow? Which typically has a better net return? So we're going to pick like for like. We're going to pick a REIT, which is a real estate investment trust, or a property fund versus a property, and that's going to give us a good understanding. Now, quite commonly, a lot of property funds may have gross yields of anywhere between, say, 6 to 8%, depending on the level of leverage that they've got with inside the fund or the type of assets that they own. But we're just going to use some share REIT, real estate investment trust, versus properties, for instance, and we're going to use that same $100,000 investment. So we've invested that $100,000 into a REIT, and let's say that the return is 6%. So we can reliably say that on our $100,000, we're going to be receiving a 6K gross return. Now, quite often in these REITs, they will have their management fees that they do tack on. And sometimes you might have a reduction in terms of your return that you're receiving. So that net return might be slightly lower. But let's say for argument's sake that there is a management fee of 1%. That 1% management fee on the amount that we've invested, which is our 6% return, now equates to a $5,000 income. And therefore, we have a net yield now of 5%. So we can see here that our gross yield, GY, is 6%. And our net yield after expenses are taken into account is now 5%. So quite often you'll find that with shares, you might have lower costs, lower occupancy costs, lower transaction costs, potentially lower investment costs, because a lot of it's done pre-getting the yield or pre-getting the dividend. And again, we look at a share, for instance, there's a P&L, there is the income, the various different expenses, and then there's the net profit. And from that net profit, we generally receive our income, our yield, our dividend, and that potentially is our net versus gross. In our property transaction, this is what commonly we see, and many people invest in property, and it's always been a go-to and very safe investment for many people. But let's say for argument's sake, we've just purchased that $100,000 property, and it's achieving a 10% gross yield. It's getting $10,000 a year in income, and that's rental income. So we've got our $10,000 of rent, and that becomes now our gross yield. Quite commonly, when I see a lot of people buying cheaper properties, they do typically have far substantially higher gross yields. We talk about denominator investment, and denominator investment means that, yes, if we've got a low purchase price for a property and a very high rent, we'll have a significantly higher gross yield. But moving forward, then we've got all the same level of occupancy costs that a $500,000 property might have. And therefore, with a $500,000 property is only renting at $500 a week, achieving roughly a 5.2% gross yield, we've got a higher amount of rent on a higher denominator, and therefore our gross yield reduces, but our cash flow might be far substantially better. But for the purpose of this particular equation and the purpose of this particular scenario, I want to run with a $100,000 property, achieving a $10,000 gross rent, which provides us a 10% gross yield. But on that 10% gross yield and that $10,000 rental income, now what we do have is our occupancy costs that come with the property. And that includes council rates, water rates, insurance. And for this particular purpose, we've now got expenses of water rates, council rates, and insurance of $3,000. 3K costs. On top of a property, we might have a provision for repairs and maintenance, and we're also going to have our property agent fees. And for argument's sake, let's call that another $2,000 investment fees. What we do have now is a $10,000 gross rent. Remember our 10% gross yield. We've got our $5,000 worth of occupancy costs, which include council, water, insurance, property agent fees, and repairs and maintenance. And that now is providing us a 5%, a $5,000 profit, 5% net yield. So this is what we need to be looking at when we are comparing our gross versus rent. So we spoke about the property getting $10,000 a year on a $100,000 purchase price, and that came back to a 10% gross yield. So what we have now is a $10,000 income on that $100,000 property, returning a 10% gross yield. We also need to consider the occupancy cost, which in this case is $5,000 of expenses that we're going to have to pay on that property regardless of its income. That leaves us with a $5,000 overall net income, which translates to a 5% net yield. So we can see very quickly how a 10% gross yield in property translates into a 5% net yield in property, losing half of its returning costs. And this is a very common scenario that I see all the time in the shares versus property debates. Many pro shares people will discuss there is significantly lesser costs in holding those shares, sometimes translating into a much closer gross versus net yield scenario. And many people will say that the time involved in shares is far substantially less than property, and you're getting a better dollar for dollar value. And then the pro property people will talk about, well, you don't necessarily have a lot of leverage in shares. It's high risk. There might be margin calls. It's harder to get loans. So property for us is a much better way. But where I see people become very stuck and where I see people do fail is that when they are purchasing property, they're focusing primarily on that gross yield. They're focusing primarily on that 10% gross yield. Why? Because it's really good to tell your friends at the barbecue that, hey, I've just bought a property and I'm getting 10% gross yield. And I've heard it so many times across my clients and across a lot of my friends as well. But it's then breaking that gross yield down to really understand what are the costs associated with it. Now, typically speaking, again, we go back to our concept we spoke about, low denominator properties. So that's the lower purchase price properties. They still generally have most of the same costs a higher purchase price property would, like a kitchen, a bathroom, a hot water system, a new roof or gutters and repairs and maintenance. And every time you are spending money on that particular property, you are spending a high percentage of the property's cost value. So it's always important to understand when you're purchasing a property or buying shares, it's a bit of that, you need to understand your gross versus net scenario. I'm going to share with you a story about a client of mine many, many years ago. We're talking probably 2013, 2014, that were looking to purchase an investment property unit in a very regional area. And they've called me up and they said, Jeremy, we found a really cracking property. This property is a one-bedroom unit, and we're going to be spending only $60,000. And this, we'll talk about this scenario's $60,000, all inclusive of all fees. That's stamp duty, soliciting fees. But $60,000 was the overall purchase price of this particular unit. Now, if you're looking at me saying, or you're hearing me saying, Jeremy, that's crazy, $60,000, what are you talking about? I can probably dare say that the prices really haven't moved too much. Now being where we are compared to all those years ago, but $60,000 was the purchase of this particular property. Now it was achieving, and they were so proud to tell me, Jeremy, this property here, it's achieving a 16% gross yield. Now for anybody out there, 16% gross yield on a $60,000 investment, the gross rent was $9,600 per year. So imagine going to your barbecue. Guys, I found a property. I paid $60,000 for it. It's getting 16% gross yield, $9,600 a year. You can't get that in the bank account. That's an unreal result. Then we had to really break down the numbers because, again, we need to challenge ourselves. When it sounds too good to be true, it generally is. So I started to ask more questions. I said, look, let's go through a bit of the occupancy costs. I really want to understand what is our net yield going to look like at the end of the day. So he went back to the agent and started to rattle off some numbers. And he spoke about to me and he said, Jeremy, look, I've got all the numbers. I'm still really happy with it. I think I'm going to go ahead. I said, look, before we do, let's just have a little bit of a chat. Let's just put the numbers on a piece of paper, stare at them for a minute, and then you can go ahead and sign. So he told me, he said, Jeremy, the council rates. The council rates were about $2,500. By memory, $2,580. Then we've got strata fees. Now, in this particular cost, the strata fees or body corporate is a cost that we must pay towards the maintenance of the building and the occupancy costs of the building, which will include things like insurances of the building, more common expenses. But for this particular case, it was $4K. Then we had the expenses of management fees, were another $1,000. Now, typically speaking, in these lower rental properties, the management fee needs to be a bit higher. Why? Because we've got lower rent, property managers doing a significant amount of work, and that's the way that they remunerate themselves for it. On top of that, we had some water costs of around about, say, $600 per year. And we also had some provision for repairs and maintenance. Now, all properties will have a provision for repairs and maintenance. And in this particular case, that provision of repairs and maintenance was for $500. Now, in total, we've got $8,680 of overall expenses in relation to this property. So $8,680 worth of expenses for this particular property. So let's just bring that into consideration. Expenses, $8,680 on $9,600 worth of rent. What we have now is a $920 net income. Now, when I spoke to the particular client about that, I said, hey, you're paying this property in cash. There's no debt or leverage against it. You're only going to earn $920 a year of income in what they call net passing income or positive cash flow. And he said, Jeremy, that's still good, right? $920. So I had to really then break it down in percentages. And I really had to show him like for like what he was investing in so he could make an informed decision. Well, I said at $920, you're only getting a 1.5% net yield on the investment. So after everything taken into account, you're only getting a 1.5% net yield on the investment. And I said, let's have a look at some other assets that are currently out there so we can do some like-for-like comparisons. Now, when you talk about investing in cash in the bank in a term deposit, that's one of the biggest things where people always tell you it's cash. Cash is trash. You don't put money in the bank. You're not going to get a really good return. So I wanted to go with the very ultimate opposite end of the spectrum because I know that this gentleman was very big in his property investment journey. He loved property. He breathed property. So I said, you know what? I'm going to go with an investment that he would never consider. The first thing he's going to tell me it's cash is trash. So I said, let's have a look at putting your money in a term deposit for say 12 months. Now I said to him, I went on, in the internet at that particular stage, and term deposit rates were around about 5.5% for 12 months. So I said, if you put your $60,000 into a 12-month term deposit at 5.5%, you would be achieving a $3,300 return at 5.5%. Now, in this particular case, there is no expenses associated with the term deposit. You put your money in the bank, they make a truckload of money off you, and they give you a pittance in return, 5.5%. But when he compared his 5.5% net yield from a term deposit versus his 1.5% net yield at full occupancy of the property being rented, and with some minor provisions in repairs and maintenance, all it needed was a hot water system to blow or some small issues, say for instance with the kitchen, and he's lost his net income. So this is a very clear example of where a 16% gross yield, something that sounds absolutely extraordinary, can turn into almost a income nightmare, achieving a 1.5% net income on the basis that things go exactly to plan, versus a cash is trash investment such as term deposit, where many people don't even explore it, they won't do it, it's not worth it, and it was achieving back then a 5.5% return with no applicable costs attached to it. You can see very clearly where the investment, where most people consider as a poor investment, putting money in the bank versus buying a property, you can see very much who the clear winner was. So this is a very good indication of where you need to make sure that when you're buying an asset, whether it's shares, REITs, whether it's a property, whether it's gold and silver, collectibles, cryptocurrency, or anything like that, you need to make sure that you understand of what the gross yield you're getting looks like versus the net yield that you're getting. And quite often people will look at other asset classes like commercial property where net yields are very much quoted as part of the passing income or the passing return of a property. But for most of us out there who are investing in ordinary investments, as I said, like residential property or even some commercial, in most cases shares, we need to understand the difference of what the gross return is, which is the number on a piece of paper, versus the net yield, which is the money that hits our bank account. So I just want to really summarize what we've learned here today. So we've spoken about gross yield, we've spoken about net yield, we've spoken about what income goes on a piece of paper versus what income comes into our bank account. We really need to make sure that when we're looking at investing, we're really looking at both sides of the equation. Yes, we do need to understand the gross level of return that that particular investment's going to provide us, but we also need to factor in the various expenses that are taken into consideration to earn that level of income that the investment is providing us. That net yield is potentially what you're going to be looking at using that into the future to safeguard your retirement or to pay for your various living costs or your goals and aspirations. So it's so important. I say it again, we need to go in with our eyes extremely open, not get caught up in the headlines, because as an investment advisor, real estate agent, or property buyer, it's so easy to create really strong buzzwords. 10% gross yield, high gross yield in return. but it's then really breaking down those particular expenses that are associated with it and understanding one of the most important things. We need to understand how the denominator of the investment that we're purchasing really impacts our level of return. So the cheaper the asset, the higher the costs, the high percentage of the cost versus the overall purchase price of the investment. So we need to make sure that we don't get carried away in buying those very cheap investments, high cost investments, high yielding investments, but really the underlying net yield is what we're looking at being extremely poor. We saw in that example how 16% turns into 1.5%, which can turn into 0% very quickly. And we've seen how we really need to contrast that with other investments which we wouldn't even think about doing, and really understanding the level of net yield that they're obtaining, so we can really start to then compare asset classes or apples with apples to make sure that we're putting our money in the best asset for the best period of time, which is a very strong retirement and a very healthy bank balance. I'm Jeremy Iannuzzelli, and that's what school should have taught you.